So we finished up talking about stealing. That much I'm sure of. And that would actually be the 8th commandment, because we've still got a couple of other ones to go. So we're going to talk about the 9th commandment. And at the end of this, I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences between the way that the Christian churches historically have numbered the 10 commandments, the way that the Jewish leadership has numbered the 10 commandments. There's about 3 different ways that they are numbered to still get 10 commandments, but to kind of apportion the different commandments to different numbers. And we'll talk about that at the end of this thing. But that's part of why I tend to get a little bit confused, is because I spend too much time reading other people's ideas and not actually paying enough attention to my own sometimes. So today we're going to be talking. Well, let me ask you a question before we start to talk about what we're going to be talking about. And the question I have for you is a legal question, which is, what is the difference, legally speaking, between evidence and proof? Can you define for me what evidence is and what proof is and how they're different?
I think sometimes you might have an evidence, but you can't prove it.
Okay.
Because you have nobody to back you up to prove the evidence you have.
Okay. So give me an example or a hypothetical of a kind of a situation where you would have evidence that you needed somebody to back you up for it.
See, if I see something, for example, a neighbor, and I know that just brought a load of stuff in it, another one that was stolen, but I have no one who did see it too,
okay,
who can prove with me. We
So you saw something stolen being taken to this house. So, okay, so in that situation, what you're saying is that your word alone isn't going to be enough to prove the case against a person.
And then where did they put it? It might have been
okay, so
again, so how do I prove I saw that?
Okay,
there?
All right, so that's an idea. Steve, and that's not bad actually. Steve, go ahead.
Our dog is eating some of my plants.
You sound bad.
And I find the evidence of it scattered around, and I suspect it's her, but the proof is when I see that the plant has been eaten and there's still parts of it hanging out of her mouth. That would be the proof.
Okay, so you would say that when evidence rises to a certain level, or when it is directly tied to the event itself, then that will rise to the level of proof. Okay, Linda.
Well, it seems like throughout the Bible, it says 2 or 3 witnesses
Okay.
to have proof, so it's not just one person's story.
Okay, so there is a standard of proof that's given in the Bible, particularly when it comes to murder and to a crime that leads to execution. Anybody else want to weigh in on this? The cop is smart enough to keep his mouth shut because he knows this is a trick question, I think. So, okay. So here's the thing. All right, you have the right ideas, but the actual difference in our legal system between evidence and proof is that everything you have just stated to me is actually different kinds of evidence, except what Linda said. Linda actually was talking about standard of proof. Seeing your neighbor take stuff that's stolen into their house, seeing your plants torn up, even seeing the evidence of the plants in your dog's mouth, those are all evidence. Proof is enough evidence to convince you that something is true. So in your case, you had a standard of proof in your head. Steve, I'm pointing at you. You had a standard of proof in your head, which was, I need more than just things scattered around. I need to see my dog doing it. I need to see it in my dog's mouth. Once that piece of evidence was shown to you, you then had sufficient proof in your mind to conclude that the dog had been the one that was doing it.
Well, and she looked guilty.
And she looks, well, the thing about most dogs, though, is if you speak to them in the right tone of voice, they all look guilty. So, you can make any dog look guilty no matter what if you just talk to them the wrong way or the right way. So when we talk about what you're seeing people taking things in and out of the house, it's probably not enough on your word. But if you were to tell law enforcement what you've seen, they might open an investigation, and they might attempt to develop additional evidence. And if they developed enough of it, they could take it to well, first of all, they would have to take it to either a judge for a preliminary hearing or to a grand jury for an indictment at a low standard of proof. And that grand jury or that judge would use that standard of proof and either decide whether there was enough evidence to meet it or not enough evidence. If they did, then it would move on to a trial in front of a jury or a judge. And there again, there would be a much higher standard of proof. What's the standard of proof in our criminal cases in America?
12 people agreeing?
To what? You have to be found guilty beyond what?
Reasonable
There we go. Okay, reasonable doubt. You have to be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That is our standard of proof in criminal cases. Now, it's a much lower standard of proof in civil cases. It's preponderance of the evidence. It just means there's a little more evidence on the favor of one side than the other side. And there's an intermediate standard of proof that's called, actually I'm forgetting what it's called exactly, but basically it's sort of like super preponderance of the evidence, where there has to be clear and convincing. That's what it's called. So there has to be enough to make it, where pretty much any reasonable person, or most reasonable people say, yes, that's most likely what happened. But beyond a reasonable doubt is a much higher standard. Beyond a reasonable doubt is basically that you cannot have any reasonable doubt. Now, in the case of your dog, it is conceivable we could come up with some set of circumstances that led to your dog having the plants in his mouth that did not involve him actually endeavoring to eat them. We would probably have to strain a little bit to come up with something like that, and more importantly, we would probably all come up with something that was fairly laughable as an actual idea. And that's why we call it reasonable. So reasonable doubt doesn't mean that anything you can think of, space aliens came down and put the gun in his hand and pulled the trigger, that's why she's dead. That's not a reasonable doubt. But the thing that's important to understand is the difference between evidence and proof. Sometimes what people will say is, I've got proof of something. Well, no, you don't. You have evidence of something. And when you provide that evidence to the person who's making a decision about what they're seeing, then it may or may not prove it to their satisfaction. And this is one of the reasons why we have so much confusion today in terms of when somebody does something wrong or appears to do something wrong, and then the court case doesn't go the way we think it should. Because the problem is that the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt for the 12 people sitting on that jury. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt for all the rest of us reasonable people out here who are making decisions based on only part of the evidence that we think we know is enough. And so what happens is that these 12 people on the jury hear the evidence, and they apply the standard as they understand it, with all of their inherent biases and experiences and background and all that other stuff. And through the lens of all that stuff, they say, is this enough evidence to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt? And a lot of times they say yes when we would say no. And other times they say no when we would say yes. And we get upset and we get confused because we can't understand how they can possibly be so stupid as to not understand what's obvious to the rest of us. But the truth is that they're dealing with a different set of circumstances than we are. And so it's really challenging to understand evidence and proof, because basically what it says to us is that we can have the same set of facts, and we can all have the same set of facts in front of us, and yet we can actually come up with different conclusions about what those facts mean. And that's actually built into our justice system, which seems sort of unfair in one sense, because that means that if you get the right jury, you're not guilty, and if you get the wrong jury, you are guilty. And that is actually built into our justice system as well. And hopefully most of our cases don't fall into that fairly narrow band where you do see that happen. But the problem is that it tends to be the most sensationalistic ones, the ones that get the most publicity, that do fall into that narrow band, because they have elements of confusion or whatever you want to call it, and so it creates those problems. So why am I talking about this? Why am I talking about evidence and proof? Well, okay, actually, let me go ahead and put this thing up here. So this is the formal definition of evidence. Evidence is anything presented in support of an assertion made in the course of a legal proceeding. It can also be outside of a legal proceeding. It can be considered that way as well. Types of evidence used in modern legal proceedings include testimony. So what Sylvia's talking about, I saw this happen. Documents, so something that was written that somebody said or did. Physical evidence, which is things like the bits of flour or the bits of flour in the dog's mouth or whatever it is. These are all types of evidence. Proof is the presentation of evidence that is sufficient to meet or exceed the applicable standard of proof required for a favorable judgment, whichever side you're on. Proof is what's enough to get you where you want to be. So proof is made up of evidence, but evidence doesn't always lead to proof for a certain person. And this is why when you have a conversation with someone about politics, that it gets off the rails real fast most of the time. Because you all may be looking at the same evidence, but if your standards of proof are different for what the evidence means, you're not going to be able to come to an agreement about a political position. So, one person believes that President Trump was corrupt and did all these bad things. And because they believe that, the evidence that they see naturally leads them to have a very low standard of proof. It's easy for them to say, yeah, there's no question, he's definitely guilty. On the other side of it, you have people who think that President Trump is, and I'm not joking about this, the second coming of the Messiah. There are actually pastors who are preaching from their pulpits that Trump is the second coming of Jesus. And if you believe that, then there is nothing that anyone can present to you that is going to convince you that he shouldn't be president again. There's no way, because what you believe shapes how you view the evidence. Now, that's a strength and a weakness depending on how you look at it within our legal system, and it's definitely a strength or a weakness of our political system, but it's a situation that's become increasingly polarized for us in both cases over the past 40 or 50 years. As we have become increasingly politically polarized, and as we have become increasingly polarized in terms of how we view justice and how justice should be done. And so it complicates the situation. So, again, briefly, I forgot to go through this. In most civil cases, the standard is preponderance of the evidence, enough evidence to show the plaintiff's claim is more likely than not. In criminal cases, beyond a reasonable doubt, much higher standard that requires strong evidence supporting each element of the offense. So, all right, so that's one. Now let me ask you a different one. Anybody willing to try to tell me the difference between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence?
I believe direct evidence is like an exhibit, like a physical piece of evidence, and circumstantial evidence may be something someone saw or is reporting that they saw.
Okay, you may have actually exactly reversed that, but
Did
we'll
I
get
do
to that
it
in
wrong?
just a second.
Okay.
Anybody else want to try before I weigh in on this? Jerry, go for it.
Circumstantial would be having your telephone in a location and you're assuming that you're also with the telephone.
Okay. So circumstantial would be, okay, we'll get to that. You're right that that's the type of circumstantial evidence.
I think we all understand what direct evidence would be, but circumstantial is also where you heard someone tell you something that they saw.
Okay.
You didn't directly see it.
That's hearsay actually, but that's
Oh, that's
kind of a
hearsay.
form of, so here's, okay, so let's try it with examples that we've been given already. Sylvia's example of seeing a truck with stolen goods pull into your neighbor's house. Is that direct evidence or circumstantial evidence? It's direct evidence. I'll explain why in just a second. What about your dog with the stuff coming out of his mouth? Direct or circumstantial?
Correct.
That's actually circumstantial evidence. So let me explain why. Okay, direct evidence is that which supports the truth of an assertion directly without the need for inference. In other words, Sylvia saw stolen parts being taken into their house. That is a crime for the possession of stolen goods. There's no need to infer anything because of what she saw. Now, you could go on to make inferences about the criminal behavior of those people, but in and of itself, her seeing that is direct evidence. Circumstantial evidence is that which supports an inference, a conclusion that an assertion is true. Because you didn't see your dog dig up the bushes, technically what you see in his mouth is circumstantial evidence because you can reasonably infer from that what he did, but it's not direct evidence because you didn't see it happen. So this is the difference, and this is something we get wrong a lot of the time. So direct evidence is usually let me rephrase that. Testimonial evidence is commonly direct evidence. It's one of the most common forms of direct evidence. I saw him do this. I saw him speeding. I saw him pull the trigger. I saw, whatever it is. Direct evidence can also be, in certain cases, tests that are done. So an example is a DUI investigation. In a DUI investigation, in general, a police officer initiates the investigation by stopping the driver. Everything they see from that on is direct evidence. They're asking questions, they're observing things, they're providing evidence. Red, watery, bloodshot eyes, slurred speech, stumbling around when he walked, failed field sobriety tests, whatever it is. And then eventually it gets to, they're going to do either a breath test or a blood test. And so they do one of those tests and they get a result back. And all of those things are direct evidence because they are observed directly by the person doing them, or in the case of the blood test, they're observed directly, they follow a chain of custody, and then the test is done directly on them. So it's all direct evidence. On the other hand, things like fingerprinting, looking for DNA, fluids, those kinds of things, those are almost always circumstantial evidence because they allow you to infer that a person was there or that a specific kind of event occurred, but because you didn't directly witness the event itself, you don't have the ability to directly testify about it. And so circumstantial evidence generally requires you to have either specialized knowledge or some kind of a background in the testing or things like that. Or you're presenting evidence and you're allowing the jury to make an inference from it in some cases. But if you're going to explain an inference to the jury, you usually have to have some kind of expertise. And that can be anything from the expertise of the law enforcement agent who has seen lots of people stumbling around drunk before, or the guy at the lab who tested the stuff who has a degree in chemistry or whatever it is. It can be a lot of different things. Direct evidence is the kind of evidence that most of the time lay people who don't have any specialized training, are able to provide because they saw something happen, they heard something happen, whatever it is. And so these are the basic differences between these two things. Now, circumstantial evidence is actually, we tend to think of it as a newer category, and it is in the sense that there's a lot more stuff that we can do circumstantially than we could 100 years ago with DNA and fingerprints. Well, fingerprints have gone back that far, but they weren't really widely accepted. Fingerprints and fluids and blood typing and all sorts of different things like that. There's a lot more circumstantial evidence that we can gather now than we used to be able to before. But circumstantial evidence has long been around. So, for example, you've got two people out in the field, and one of them comes home and the other one doesn't come home, and he's got a bunch of axe wounds in him. There's an inference that you can make from that the first guy killed the other guy. And you don't necessarily have to have much more evidence than that as long as you can show that they were the only two ones out there. It's a pretty straightforward case from there. And so that kind of thing has gone on for a long time. Nevertheless, direct evidence tended to be much more important in the past and historically than circumstantial evidence. And circumstantial evidence has gradually become more and more important in our modern environment. But when we talk about the Bible, most of what we see, particularly when we talk about the Ten Commandments, and the one we're going to look at in just a second here, we're talking mostly about direct evidence, the word of a witness. And so in Mark chapter 14, we see what happens when a witness lies. So, Jesus is on trial. He is being tried in ultimately the procedure that will end in his being executed and crucified. And it says the chief priest and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, and they were not finding him. For many were giving false testimony against him, but their testimony was not consistent. Some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands." Not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. Technically that was something he said, but apparently they couldn't get it straight. And so Jesus is ultimately found guilty in a sham trial where there are false witnesses that come in, and the chief priest basically holds that there's sufficient evidence for him to be executed. But the problem here you have is what happens when you have people who give direct evidence and they lie. And I have been part of enough trials to know that there are definitely people who will do that. Sometimes they are defendants, other times they are friends or family of defendants. On the other side of it, there's at least one time that I'm reasonably certain I had a witness who was lying on the stand that I felt strongly enough about the situation that ultimately decided to dismiss the case because I wasn't really sure what her bias was about, but it seemed like she was lying, and I just couldn't afford to convict a guy who wasn't actually guilty of the thing. So people do lie when it comes to court. Now, we make every effort to make that difficult for people. We have them swear. Used to be they swore on a Bible, now they can if they want to. They don't have to, but they have to swear or affirm that they'll give honest testimony. Some of the reasons we got rid of the Bible and made it swear or affirm is because actually, ironically, some Christian denominations didn't like to swear in the Bible. And so atheists can do it now, whatever else it is. And not only that, we have perjury. What's perjury?
Lying.
Lying under oath. And what happens when you commit perjury?
They put you in jail.
They put you in jail, that's right. So perjury, in many cases, depending on what you've been charged with, perjury can actually be a significantly more serious offense than actually whatever it was you were originally charged with. And so to commit perjury on somebody else's behalf is especially stupid, because then you're putting yourself under the same kind of problems that the person that's already on trial is going to commit. And one of the interesting things is that while there are people who are willing to lie, and especially when there are circumstances in which they know that there's no real way you can challenge what they're saying, most people are very reluctant to lie under oath. And the reason is because of the risk of, well, some of them sometimes just because they're decent people, but the other reason is because of the risk of perjury. And so you see people, one of the, a slight variation of this, attorneys are prohibited from making a filing with a court that they know may not, or that they don't have the evidence to support. It doesn't even matter whether they think it's true or not. They have to believe that they have enough evidence to support the allegation before they can make a filing with the court. So during this whole election is stolen thing, we had one attorney after another, one person after another come out on President Trump's behalf and say we found lots of evidence of corruption, lots of evidence of fraud. And yet in no filing ever made before any court did any of those attorneys ever directly allege fraud. What they would allege were minor infractions or violations of, counting discrepancies and different things like that. But nobody ever said there was fraud in any of those allegations. And the reason is simple. An attorney can get up in public and say whatever he wants to, and mostly get away with it, although it turns out that some of the state bars took that a little more seriously than some of the attorneys thought they would. But what you absolutely cannot do is file a filing that you know isn't supported by evidence. You can be disbarred for that. And so all of these people who kept saying, we've got all this evidence, never made the allegation that that evidence would have supported, because I can only presume they knew they didn't really have all that evidence. And so you can know the truth of what someone is saying by whether they're willing to actually say it in court, especially if they're an attorney. But people who have experience with the law in generally are very reluctant to lie under oath. They do the smarter thing and they don't testify at all if they feel like what they have to say could get them in trouble. But by and large, they are reluctant. Now you get answers like, well, I don't remember, which is a that you can't get perjury charges off, I don't remember. Because how can I possibly prove that you didn't remember something? Or to the best of my recollection, you get a lot of those hedge phrases when somebody's testifying who doesn't want to be caught for perjury, but also doesn't really want to tell the truth. But by and large, people do tell the truth, or they simply avoid testifying because they understand the penalties and the consequences for that. And so today, well, just briefly today, but then for the next couple of weeks after that, we're going to talk about this 10th commandment that we talk about it, we think of it in terms of don't lie. That's not really what it says. I think that's the principle behind it, but that's not really what it says. What it says is, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, that is lying, but what's the difference between bearing false witness against your neighbor and simply telling a lie?
Good question.
That oath part of it.
Okay, so part of it is that you've been placed under oath. Now that's in our system. In the Jewish system, it would have been something sort of akin to that, being charged to tell the truth before God, kind of a thing. But the oath is part of it. Okay, what else? Did you start to say something, Gracie? Okay, I wasn't sure. What else? What is the problem with having somebody get up and give false testimony against somebody else in court?
Even if it doesn't go to court, if I give a false witness about somebody, their business can go bad. It's not even that they might be charged by a court, but I attacked that person's
Character.
Yes.
character and identity and all that, and some cannot even recover from.
Okay, so the heart of it is, whether it's, as you said, whether it's in court or whether it's in a public arena of some sort, when we give false witness, we're doing something that causes great harm to someone else, as opposed to lying, which definitely causes harm. Don't misunderstand me. But most lies are told to protect myself. They're told to cover up something stupid I did. They're told because I try to make myself look more important than I am. And all those things are bad, and all those things can cause problems. But at the end of the day, most of the time, the most likely blowback is going to be on me when everybody finds out that I was lying. But when I start telling lies about other people, about what they're doing, that challenge their character, challenge their qualifications, that challenge their behavior, especially in court, where they could be looking at some kind of, whether it's civil fines or something like that, or whether it's some kind of criminal charges with prison time and all that sort of stuff. When I do those kinds of things, the level of harm is ramped up greatly. It's the same kind of reasons why doctors and lawyers have very high ethical standards, which in the case of lawyers we routinely ignore. But the reason is because we can do so much damage. Doctors, obviously, it's really easy to see how a doctor who doesn't live up to his ethical standards or her ethical standards can make a big mess of things in a hurry. But lawyers can do enormous amounts of damage as well, either by prosecuting people who don't deserve to be prosecuted, by presenting false evidence that causes the case to get dismissed that shouldn't have been dismissed, by getting up and speaking on behalf of clients and disparaging other people unjustly and then causing the kind of harm that Sylvia's talking about. The simple reality is that within the legal system, the harm that can be done when people tell lies is enormous. And that translates outside of the legal system to causing huge damage to people. And today, because of our internet and because of all the different social media that we have and how quickly false information spreads, in some ways faster than good information, it can be even more problematic. And it can be even more devastating to people. There's an interesting article, and I don't remember all the details of this, so I'm just going to kind of sum this up. But basically, there was a poster, a woman who posted on whatever Twitter, although now it's X, because that makes more sense. Anyway, posted on Twitter on a regular basis, and she's very much a socially conscious and concerned kind of a person. And I forget the event that had happened, but it had been something like there was some kind of a fairly obvious situation where somebody had misused their power in a way that is kind of abusive towards other people. And it was kind of a situation where it was a white person who kind of was getting away with something. And she made the comment on Twitter sarcastically that well, I guess at least she didn't have to worry about it because she was a white woman, so no problem for her. And she made it sarcastically, but the problem is, of course, that sarcasm doesn't necessarily translate on Twitter because Twitter is typed, not said. The bigger problem was that she made that comment right before she got on a plane flight across the Atlantic Ocean that took about 8.5 hours. And by the time she landed 8.5 hours later, that story had been circulated and had been misinterpreted and had been assessed to her to the point where her entire social life was ruined. Completely great. She'd been fired from her job. It was just a complete disaster because of one thing that she said, and a small group of people that took it the wrong way and then just kept repeating it until it just snowballed. Now that's extreme, but that's not as uncommon as we'd like to think it is at this point.
I have this, it's a little placard that I think was probably printed back in the 20s or 30s, and I mounted it on the wall, and it says, a lie travels around the world before the truth can get its boots on.
Yeah.
It's true. And one of the reasons why that's true is because, generally speaking, a lie is quick. It's easy to tell a lie in 150 characters or less, which is the Twitter standard. It is much more complicated to tell the truth in 150 characters or less most of the time, because the truth is nuanced and the truth is complicated, and the truth has issues that go along with it and explanations that go along with it, and a lie doesn't need those things. And so it is extremely easy today to make a real mess for someone else, even by just lying. In this case, it was something she said that was misunderstood and then retransmitted. But you can flat out lie about stuff, and it can take a long time for anybody to actually slow that process down and say, no, wait a minute. And it's possible at this point, because of the way that the media works, whether it's somebody who gets up and says something in front of people, whether it's somebody who sends out a tweet or I don't know what you'd call it, an X now. Anyway, whenever somebody sends out one of those, whether it's somebody posts something on YouTube, something that's false takes at least a little while for somebody to actually say, wait a minute, that's not true. And by the time, wait a minute, that's not true gets said, if the thing that was false is interesting enough or sounds enough like truth to enough people, they're going to accept that as truth, and they're not going to listen to or even notice the retraction or the argument against the truth of that. And so the damage that can be done, again, is huge, because what you can end up doing is have a lot of people who think that they know the truth about things, who are in fact simply repeating false statements that they don't realize are even wrong. because it ties in, and it particularly is effective in our modern political environment, because a lot of times those things tie into, again, what we are inclined to believe is true anyway. You know, if I'm a gun rights enthusiast and I hear that Biden has just signed legislation outlawing all rifles, or all, high capacity rifles, my first instinct is to say, oh yeah, that's probably true. Although my second instinct should be to say, well, wait a minute, doesn't Congress have to pass legislation, and isn't at least one of the houses of Congress controlled by Republicans who are not going to pass? So it's part of your brain that should be able to censor some of that stuff. But nevertheless, when our tendency is to favor certain ways of thinking, as soon as we see a lie that kind of fits in with that, we want to kind of ride on with that lie. And it can get really hard to admit to, avoid that. And so this false witness thing is even more of a problem in our modern society than it was several thousand years ago when Moses told the Israelites not to do it. And so the importance of us understanding what is meant by this and living in a way that honors this is really, really important, especially for those of you who do a lot of online news, where you get news online, you're communicating a lot online. It's very important that you not be part of the problem, that you instead be part of the solution. So, Leviticus chapter 19, God says, you shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, so as to profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Okay, so there's a number of things in here. You shall not steal nor deal falsely. What do you think it means to deal falsely? Okay, kind of, but in this case, I think because of the fact that it's tied to not stealing, and the very next thing is don't lie, it means something a little different than that.
My donkey is in perfect shape.
Ah, okay. My car is running just fine. There's nothing wrong with it that you will find out before at least 10 to 15 miles. And that sort of thing. So dealing falsely is doing something in a way that takes advantage of your knowledge of the situation, or the person you're dealing with, their lack of knowledge of the situation. So this can be everything from the kind of stuff we're talking about here to something as extreme as forging counterfeit money, or forging a counterfeit antique and trying to sell it. I mean, all those kinds of things are dealing falsely. So it's interesting. Now this is a different thing. This is very different from bearing false witness, or it's significantly different from bearing false witness. But notice here that what he's basically saying is don't cheat each other. During this period of time, one of the most infamous ways of cheating each other, actually even more so during Jesus' time, was by altering the weight of either currency or of something that was weighed to determine how much of something you had. So, for example, if I take and I've got a bunch of gold coins of the emperor, which are very imprecisely pressed, unlike the coins that we have today that are extremely precisely pressed and have that, that edge around them, it makes it really, really hard to shave little bits of them off, and also because they're not made of anything valuable, it would make it really stupid to shave any of them off. But if your coins are made out of gold or silver or even copper back then, and they're not particularly uniform in shape, it's not so hard to shave just maybe a little bit off of it, and if you do that over time, that can be some significant gold, if you're a merchant especially, or a tax collector. If you've got a lot of money moving through your hands, that can start to really make a difference. On the other side of it, if you're someone who buys something for people, let's say you buy fish, loads of fish from someone, so you have a scale set up. Your scale, if you want to cheat them, is going to have extra heavy weights on it. So instead of a weight that's a pound, it's going to be a pound and an ounce. Or instead of a weight that's 100 pounds, it's going to be 105 pounds or something like that. A small enough difference that most people can't tell the difference, but what that does is it makes the actual weight of the fish seem lower than they are. Because 105 pounds against 100 pounds of fish makes it look like you're still short 5 pounds. Whereas you should be showing that that's actually 100 pounds. So there's ways you can really easily cheat someone when you have a less precise system of weights and measurements and money than we do now. And that's one of the reasons there are so many provisions that go into how we weigh things and how we measure things and how we take care of our currency to try to minimize the risk of corruption and counterfeiting. So dealing falsely, he says, and he also says, you shall not lie to one another. So dealing falsely, we can see where there's a greater harm there than there might be for just telling a little white lie, because there you're taking advantage of someone. You're getting the benefit of a bargain that they're not getting. But lying to one another is a much more catch-all kind of a thing, and that includes everything from telling stories about yourself to make yourself look better than you are, to making up an excuse for why you're late, or telling all sorts of things. You're trying to get out of trouble by lying, whatever it might be. He says you're not supposed to lie to one another. So this is pretty much a catch-all. Now, so as I say, the Ten Commandments do not explicitly contain a provision not to lie. But the Ten Commandments can contain a provision that when you extrapolate the logic behind it, makes it pretty clear why you're not supposed to lie. But then he goes on to say something, and I think this is really important. He says, you shall not swear falsely by my name so as to profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. So he doesn't stop with dealing falsely or lying to one another. He's kind of going back to that false witness thing, or more importantly, the idea of somebody swearing by the Lord or swearing by God, which was not necessarily an uncommon thing in the environment in which the Hebrews found themselves, and would not necessarily have been that uncommon of a thing in their dealings either. In fact, Jesus ends up talking about that. Don't swear by anything. Just give your yes and your no, and that's good enough. But this idea of swearing by God's name, the idea when you call on God's name to swear, why would we do that? Why would we call on God's name and say to give an oath? I don't mean to swear like to use bad language. I mean, if you're going to give an oath, why would you do that?
It was in that time, it was a guarantee that what you were saying had greater merit and greater importance and was more likely to be upheld.
Okay, true, but why?
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 Because there's nothing higher than God.
Okay, so there's nothing higher than God to swear on, but what is the consequence theoretically if you swear on God's name and you tell a lie?
A lightning bolt.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, in essence, what you're doing when you swear in God's name, if you're swearing falsely, is you're calling down the potential for ruin on yourself. And in fact, when you look, for example, in the Gospels, when Peter denies Christ 3 times, one of the times that he does it, he calls down curses on himself. Now, he doesn't mean in the sense of God strike me dead. What he's saying is, if I'm not telling the truth, may God strike me dead. And that's kind of the underlying principle behind calling on the name of the Lord as a means of giving an oath. Is you're basically saying, I'm calling God's attention to this, and if I'm not telling the truth, then I'm calling on God to deal with me as a liar. So when you do that, and you do swear falsely, God says you're profaning my name. You are using my name in a way that is profane, that is debasing it, that is making it less of value than it would otherwise be, because God's name should be associated with truth and honesty and right dealing. And so God says you do that at your own peril because of the significance of my name. And the Israelites became so paranoid about using God's name directly that they basically came up with a way to not only not to say it in public, but also not even to read it in the scriptures directly. And they created a term, Adonai, that was not originally in the scriptures, that basically it's saying the same thing about God, the God who, the Tetragrammaton says, the Yahweh says. But it's saying it in a totally different word, and then within the text, what they would do is they would go in and put markers around the word Yahweh so that whoever was reading it knew, don't say this, say the other thing. And so basically they created what we would think of as a very elaborate bleeping system for God's name, where instead of God's name you have Adonai, and that would be the name that was used. And so so in that situation, then somebody might argue, well, I didn't swear by God's name, I just swore by his substitute name. And I'm pretty sure that God's response to that would be, that's just a lot of legalistic wranglings, because the fact is that you're still swearing by my name. Sylvia.
And that did not say the name or Hashem or Adonai, but that's not what God says, because it's how we live today. If I'm a Christian, okay, and I swear falsely by God, and that's not right. Oh, look at that Christian. What what do I say about my God
Right,
and the witness to my God?
right. What does it say about what you think about your God when you're willing to say
Yeah.
something like that? Yeah. Okay, we're going to stop here. We're going to pick up next week looking at the importance of witnesses in proceedings in the scriptures. But
I was just gonna say real quick, I don't think they do it in court anymore, but when you hold up your hand and say you swear to tell the truth, so help
So
you
help you
God,
God, yeah.
it's basically the same
yes,
concept.
it is. That's right.
Yeah.
And they removed that, although you can still say that if you want to, but they removed that from the law because of the issues with other religions and even some Christian religions. But that was, for a very long time, that was dealt with. Okay. Thank you guys for your participation. We're going to take a break for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll begin back up at 10:30.